So yeah, Mothers of Invention is, of course, a podcast on feminist solutions to the climate crisis. But for me, that has always had to mean intersectional feminism. So that includes Black and Brown folks, includes Indigenous folks, it includes gender non-conforming folks and transgender folks. The show really is about creating a platform for marginalized voices, because wherever there are marginalized people, those are the folks who are going to be affected by climate and environmental issues first and foremost. And so that's why, this season, every single interviewee, every single mother, we lovingly call them, is of color or Indigenous this season. Behind the scenes, also, our team is almost exclusively women of color. And Mary and Maeve, although, visibly white feminists, actually have incredibly rich backgrounds working in diverse communities and working on issues within Black and Brown communities as well. I'm super excited to welcome Ayana and Destiny from Generation Green for our first episode discussion on our reparations episode. So first of all, you guys, welcome. Thank you so much for coming and starring on our Instagram feed this week.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah,
We're excited to be on this.
Well, first of all, we need to know who you guys are for folks that don't know. So if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves a little bit, that would be great.
My name is Destiny Hodges. I am the founder and executive director of Generation Green. Generation Green is a youth-led intergenerational community of Black environmentalists weaving together all facets of Black life and social justice through an environmental and climate liberation lens. So I got into climate and environment. I grew up in Alabama, and so in my grandmother's house, we were in the country, always outdoors, always had a love and admiration for wildlife and the environment. Loved National Geographic and Animal Planet, watched it all day, but I never saw people of color highlighted in the stories and the films, and I love film and media. I never saw people of color highlighted in those stories when it came to climate change and how ecosystems and environments were changing. And so I, took a vow that I would use my background in journalism and media to do that. And so Generation Green kind of stemmed from that, after having an exposure to the environmental space and seeing the white supremacism that was present in the space, and the lack of platforms for voices for people of color, specifically Black youth. That's what led me to starting Generation Green. And I had met so many incredible Black colleagues of mine who were also in college or who were recent graduates. And we kind of got together and was like, let's do it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ayana Albertini-Fleurant. I am a New York City native, DC resident, Howard University graduate, and I am the Director of Policy and Programming for Generation Green. I oversee our multiple departments, which include everything from careers, diasporic engagement, and HBCU connection. And as well as our environmental liberation policy platform. So for me, like I said, I'm a Brooklyn native, so there wasn't necessarily a huge environment or natural landscape to inspire me into this career path. But however, when I was in high school and I had the privilege of being in this really rigorous honors environmental course, or honors environmental science course, literally just having that education and the exposure to the issues and learning the science of what is actually going on here and all of the insane things that people have done like to destroy the environment and degrade it, I just immediately recognize that as a huge problem. And I was always passionate about social justice and race relations, but I always felt like the two couldn't connect for me. So that was a really tough point of tension. And then after getting into Howard and taking on the environmental studies program, like about halfway through my time at Howard, that was for the first time I was able to connect the two. And take environmental justice, environmental inequality, have the sociological perspective of these environmental issues. And from there, environmental justice just made sense to me. And I was always looking for ways to work around those issues, but I just figured that at Big Greens, it just wasn't, it wasn't being centered enough for me. So it was great to find like-minded people at Howard, linking up with Destiny and others on our core team, and realizing that we all felt the same way. We all had the same experiences, and we all wanted to see this talked about in a different way. So that's pretty much my story.
The reason that Generation Green was created is because we need a safe space for Black environmentalists. I, like Ayana, interned at a Big Green. It only really took me one internship for me to realize that, okay, this space is whitewashed. The mainstream version of this is whitewashed. There are few people of color in these spaces. However, people of color, receive first and the worst the effects of climate change. And so I knew right then that, especially when it comes to my generation, and we see, the emergence of the youth climate movement, that is still also very whitewashed. And that's a problem for me, because I know there's so many young Black and BIPOC individuals who are doing this amazing work, but we don't know each other and our stories aren't being front and center. So that's kind of how Generation Green got started. When we talk about environment at Generation Green, we do so in the environmental justice definition. So the environment is not just the natural environment. And this has never been the case for Black people and people of color. The environment is the interaction between social, geographical, biological, political things in our environment, structures. So social structures, natural structures, political structures, all of those make up our environment. So when we advocate for climate justice, when we advocate for environmental justice, we can't just focus on trees and the wildlife and nature. We have to focus on things that impact our lives every day, meaning racism is a part of our environment. White supremacism is a part of our environment. Gentrification, lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to healthy foods. This is a part of our environment. And so when we begin, police, that's a part of our environment. So when we begin to talk about climate justice and environmental justice, we can't do so without talking about racial justice and social justice, because all of these issues are interconnected. They're not separate.
I just need to take a sip of water here. My goodness. That was amazing. That was that was amazing. It's so true. You guys heard our episode on reparations, which is why we're talking to each other today. What did you think of the episode?
I thought it was a great episode. I would love to be connected to Kristina. She's doing incredible work in Madagascar, which is an extension of the African diaspora. And she really brought to light the importance of climate reparations. And I have so much appreciation for her work and really talking about colonialism and European exploration and how that impacted and ultimately was the start of climate change, coming in and disrupting, inhabited areas or uninhabited areas, and ultimately just changing the natural order of things, specifically for dominance and resources. And so I really appreciate that conversation.
How about you, Ayana?
Yeah, I totally agree with Destiny. I found the specific scenario with Madagascar and her experience working in there really interesting and fascinating, and I think that directly pertains to some of the stuff we are seeking to do with Generation Green in terms of working with the African diaspora. I think that, the episode was great, and it was pretty comprehensive and hitting on some essential history about why climate reparations are necessary, and how colonialism, slavery, and industrial, how that all has contributed to the current climate crisis, and just starting to think about how we can begin to make amends for that, or how Western powers can begin to make amends for that. So I look forward to getting a little deeper into some of the ways that climate and slavery reparations, they overlap, and where, you know, how white supremacism is kind of at the root of all of this, and how it's just really just, again, highlighting the point that climate reparations are an essential part of climate mitigation. So I love the conversation that happened on the prior episode, and I just hope to get a little bit more in depth with fleshing out some of those points.
Yeah, it was so hard to condense down to like a 40-minute episode. You know, I could easily do 3 seasons of just this specific subject matter. It's definitely my soft spot, you know, talking about racial justice, you know, xenophobia, intersectional feminism, all the daily plight that I personally experience and have done my whole life as well. And, you know, being able to make those connections at the top of the season was so important to me, to be able to, because we can't really, exactly as you're both saying, we can't talk about climate justice in this sort of isolated way. Like, there are reasons why we're doing this work, and these reasons are uncomfortable, they're challenging, they're global, they're not, you know, specific to one place. They're still happening today. You know, when you look at Bangladesh, they've been dealing with it. When you look at, you know, central Chad, who have lost 90% of their lake, they're dealing with it. So these are super old issues for so many different communities around the world, but we're still using these narratives that are so framed around the European global North experience. So, I mean, that's why we really wanted to get into it, is just to be able to like have that framing for every episode that comes after. But what were your thoughts on what Liddy got into about climate reparation facilities like the Warsaw Mechanism for Loss and Damage and the Green Climate Fund? Do you think they're actually feasible tools? Do you think that they're on the right, like the UN are on the right path with those facilities?
Well, I think the answer to that question lies in where they are in progress on that today, and how long people have been talking about, because when it comes to the fund, it's supposed to be, I believe, what, $100 billion that's supposed to be in that fund. It's nowhere near where it needs to be. And so I think that kind of quickly answers that question. And when it comes to the global North or Western powers paying for the damage that they've created, they never want to talk about it. They never want to take responsibility. They never want to be held liable. And this is how that again ties directly into climate reparations and even slavery reparations, is that they are responsible. We would not be in this mess, in this crisis, in this emergency, if it were not for Western powers, European powers who colonized much of the world. And so I think that that's the answer. They haven't really made a serious commitment. They signed a piece of paper, said whatever, but the reality is that they haven't actually pulled up when it comes to those commitments. Even though they were created, in some cases, I would say in good faith, they're not being followed through.
Yeah, I would agree with Destiny. I think that these are good ideas to start with, but I think adequate climate reparations is important. Not just climate reparations, but adequate. And not only do they have to compensate for the present and future damages caused by the climate crisis, which is, you know, at the fall of Western nations, but it also needs to pay for the historical damages and the like slavery, like these African nations losing part of their population, which has had economic impacts on them even today. Exploitation of resources, of land, further, and that exploitation and the economic position that a lot of these nations have been forced to be in right now, it does two things. One, it forces them to have to degrade their natural environments because they are in this agrarian economic model. They have to degrade their natural environments just to make minimal economic growth and just to survive, really. And those natural environments are obviously can be a buffer or a sink to some of the effects of climate change.
What kind of solutions you feel would be adequate, not just adequate, but also feasible as a means of reparations? Because, you know, these tools are already in place, and to Destiny's point, it's like, well, that's great. These things exist in concept, but no one's doing anything about them. Do you have any thoughts or ideas, or do you know of things that are in play that actually look more realistic?
I think more things are realistic and feasible than we think. But at the end of the day, we operate in a capitalist society, which means money is the ultimate determiner. So at the end of the day, it's going to come down to money, to compensation. And again, we really can't talk about climate change, climate justice, climate reparations without talking about colonialism. You know, the same extractivism that fossil fuel industries use today in extracting resources from land, that began when European nations decided to colonialize the world and be extractive, not only with resources, but with people for their personal gain. So an effective way to have reparations when it comes to climate, slavery in general, would be compensation. There are entire economies that have been desolated because of the history. I'm sorry, street. But there are entire economies that have been desolated because of the history of colonialism. When we look at, for instance, Haiti, which Ayana is Haitian, so she can kind of go in more on this. They paid back pay to France for years after they freed themselves in the Haitian Revolution to become a free nation. They paid that, and now they're suffering the cost because their economy is so destroyed that they have to destroy their own natural resources, whether it's trees to make wood, et cetera, to make exports to support their economy. So they are being forced to contribute to the climate crisis and are being forced to suffer even worse from the climate crisis because they don't have an economy to support themselves because of the history of colonialism that's taken place, and they had to pay for it. And this is not just the case with Haiti. This is the case with many African nations. This is the case with island nations and states all across the world. Their economies are in a position where they can't mitigate climate. And that's not their fault, and they shouldn't be forced to pay for it. So ultimately, it comes down to compensation. There needs to be support for economies. We have places like China. There's neo-colonialism taking place. China is going to the Caribbean and African nations and colonizing them to this day, and that's forcing them into millions and trillions of dollars of debt that they will never be able to pay back, and they're suffering from climate change, and they can't do anything about it because nobody is helping them financially except the people who want to exploit their resources. And this has been going on for centuries, and so reparations effectively looks like compensation, paying back all the damages that you as a nation has done, all the things that you are responsible for. And as I said earlier, Western powers don't want to take responsibility for that, but that's what has to happen, because if it doesn't start with money and compensation, then the global South will continue to get poorer and will continue to experience worse effects, while the global North can come up with whatever solutions they want to do in enough time to save their lives while people continue to die.
Yes.
I'm just going to take another sip of water over here because Destiny has me dehydrating with excitement over here. So it's amazing.
What Destiny mentioned about the economic position of exploited nations, they have been so exploited historically. They're not in an economic position to be able to lower their emissions and get all this fancy decarbonization technology. Like, Western nations can do that. We still haven't done it completely, but they can do that. That's an option. But for these countries, that shouldn't be an expectation that they're going to rapidly decarbonize and not in addition, furthermore, build resilience to climate change, right? So it's just not fair. And the example that she mentioned with Haiti, in that example, Haiti had to compensate for their freedom. They had to compensate France for the land, the loss of labor and productivity, for the Haitians' independence, right? And what did that look like? That was direct payments. So for me, what I want to see is I want to see direct payments from Western countries, formerly imperial powers, to the countries that they subjugated and exploited. That's what I want to see. I want to see direct payments. And I think that that money can be managed where it's prioritized, like creating renewable energy systems are prioritized, restoring natural environments are prioritized. But yeah, compensation for the African diaspora and the descendants of slaves for their dislocation, their trauma, the human rights violations, and labor theft of their ancestors.
Right.
So to me, it is about protecting natural sites and in the environment in those places. But it's also about that. It's also just about the massive righting of social ills, like righting those wrongs. And then, everything is right along with that, the environment and climate.
I think the frustration is, again, coming back to what Destiny was saying too, is like, we have all these facilities that exist on a global stage, but they're not being paid into because there is, and Liddy talked about it in the episode, like we're waiting around for some kind of benevolence from nations that are just so incredibly unwilling to admit the wrongs that they've done. And it seems to me that really education is like it's so simple and so obvious, but it's kind of the beginning of this arc, isn't it? It's like, and also something I brought up in the episode, like I did not learn a single word about British colonization in school. I was in British education system for over 14 years and I did not learn a single word. So you have entire generations that are growing up without this information. And I would like to think that a lot of people who did have access to that information would have a different feeling about it altogether if they knew. And that's sort of what we saw in England with, these statues coming down in Bristol and in Oxford, and certainly all across the States too. As soon as people were like, wait, what? These people did what? We've been passing these statues in the streets all our lives, like we grew up seeing them and we had no idea, So I feel like, again, the starting point really has to be like, can we just get explicit about what these issues are in the first place to be able to work on them? But the last question I really wanted to ask is about what you see actually visualize the benefits of reparations looking like. Like, what does that look like? We're talking about self-care as one aspect of our approach on the season, but also regenerative futures. Like, if reparations were in place, what would that look like for marginalized communities?
I believe that we can solve much of the world's issues in two ways: energy and food. Those are the two main things that we need to survive, to power our lifestyles, etc. Much of the world starves every year, dies of preventable diseases, and does not have access to electricity. Many Western nations, the global North, they have access to all of those things. And so it's really wealth redistribution. And that's what climate reparations is. And I think we need to understand that wealth is not only financial wealth, although that's needed in order to really have climate reparations. It's not only finance. It is the right to live, to have a flourishing life, to have food, to have water. This is what wealth is, to have something that you can pass on to the next generation as in knowledge, as in land, as in life. So when we talk about benefits, everybody has to have the right to flourish. And so energy and food are two parts of that. And that's where climate justice, which we don't really talk about justice in Generation Green, we talk about liberation. Because as we can shift from equality to equity and from equity to justice, we can shift from justice to liberation. And so the benefits of climate reparations or in reparations of slavery, because they're intertwined and they're not separate, is people being allowed to have flourishing life, is ensuring that we can live. I think one of the things that we kind of danced around but kind of touched on is that many of these nations, many of these countries are classified as underdeveloped, and like I said, don't have access to electricity, don't have access to like basic medical care. And so if they were to have those and to develop them themselves without their resources being exploited, they would be able to survive and flourish. They would be able to create solar, you know, which is a great source of energy. They would be able to provide food for the people who live there, and they wouldn't be forced to go through an industrial revolution that we had to go through and that are in some ways still in, just to get to renewable energy. And I think this is a conversation, is like, we are trying to ensure, or I hope we're trying to ensure, that developing countries that are only in that position because, again, of Western powers who have colonized the world, do not have to go through an industrial revolution where they continue to destroy even their own environment and natural resources just to get to a point where they have renewable energy and can survive and thrive. And the way to do that is that we're going to have to have reparations, because they can't do it without money. We operate in a capitalist society. It is impossible to do that without a strong economy and without money. And so those are the benefits of climate reparations, ensuring a flourishing life for everyone, primarily people of color and people who have been disenfranchised and whose land and environment has been stripped and they've been displaced because of Western powers who have colonized them.
And additionally, I think climate reparations opens the opportunity for just more, like I said, other forms of reparation and just general justice and liberation for, and I'm specifically speaking for Black and Indigenous people in general. There's so many historical wrongs that have been needed to be righted. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to bring the world into a more just, a more equitable, and a world where it isn't just the 1% that can amass this massive amount of wealth and then on the backs of the 99% in the global South. So I think that reimagining a world where everyone has an opportunity to flourish, I would love to see African people flourish, right? I would love to see us be able to move out of just an agrarian or subsistence economic model and be able to kind of just like have our economy and our societies flourish, have social cohesion. Scarcity contributes to conflict, right? Contributes to violence. I would like to see that decline, just general harmony throughout the world. I think that would bring. Education. I think reparations could go towards building up education in African, on the continent, robust food systems like Destiny mentioned, green infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, because we're gonna need it. Democratize energy, all of that. Imagine, I was reading an article and it posed the question that really got to me. Imagine if the West actually fairly paid for the resources, the labor it took out of the global South. Imagine for a second that that was fairly paid, and like basically wealth was able to be built throughout the world in unison, right? And other countries were also able to develop and modernize, build hospitals. People can, live out their purpose, follow whatever career path they wanted. And it wasn't just a polarization of subjugation and greed, right? So imagine for a second. And honestly, I'm still working to decolonize my imagination and really think of the impact that something like this could have. And then additionally, if you think about just the cultural preservation or the cultural loss that has been caused by climate change, just our way of life, our spirituality, our cultural traditions that is directly in danger due to climate change, I think that is something we can work to reclaim once we have more social and environmental stability, because African spirituality is heavily rooted in nature, and so is indigenous spirituality. So how can we really practice, how can we maintain our connection to source and to spirit when our environments are being degraded? I know that for Haiti specifically, like the deforestation issue in Haiti is actually a huge problem for our practice of voodoo, because in voodoo, spirits live in the trees, right? And we venerate them and we give offerings and all of that, and they maintain the spiritual environment and also the ecological one. So to have that deforestation issue caused by, you know, exploitation and capitalism and pressures, economic pressures, it's actually really harming our ability to practice our religion, right? We can't do that. So there are generations now that the younger generations are very disconnected to the religion, very spiritually kind of like in limbo. So those are all other like more intangible benefits or losses that have come as a result of the climate crisis and all the colonialization that has gone along with it.
Yeah, it's actually something that I noticed from doing pre-interviews with a lot of the women we featured on the show, is specifically folks from the global south. Obviously they were in the movement to protect their homes and protect their landscapes, but actually one of the primary issues for them was preservation of culture, and to be able to protect their culture, but also a lot of these communities are having to migrate away from their homes now. And in the global north, you know, we talk about movement as something, movement is something that we choose. It's not something that we necessarily are forced to do. And so that, you know, having clarity around that thought is, it just feels so, so far away from us, but it's so present for them, the idea of loss of culture. And maybe one would argue that in the global north, we've become so disconnected from our spiritual selves that is a reason why, you know, it's just not, it's not front of mind for us and the way that we treat nature.
Yeah, I'd like to add, because I know we're going to wrap up, but I do want to make sure that it goes somewhere in here. We're talking a lot about the global south and communities that have been colonized and their resources have been extracted, but I think it's important to acknowledge that prior to colonialization, these communities in many cases were thriving and had a lot of sustainable practices that were inherent to their culture. And specific, if we're talking about Black and African culture and heritage and spirituality, as Ayana mentioned, sustainability in our natural environment was such a heavy role in that. And because of the lack of education and the history of the environmental degradation and colonization that's taken place, we're no longer connected to that, or we're not able to sustain those systems because of everything that's taken place. And similar to you, how you know, weren't necessarily educated on what Britain did and how they colonized the world. In America today, we're not even taught the full history of African people. We're not even taught. It's like Africa is put into this tiny little box and is a monolith and is actually in many cases shown much smaller on maps. So it's like people across the world, people of color, are not able to connect with their identity and their heritage because of colonization. And in many cases, that's directly tied to our natural environment. We're not even able to make direct connections to our natural environment, to our heritage that did that, to work to preserve this planet because of white supremacism and colonialization. and colonization. And so that has to be made, because there have been communities and civilizations that thrived and that actually had so many sustainable practices, and they were doing great until Western cultures and European nations decided to infiltrate. And so I just want to make sure that we put in here somewhere that communities were thriving, and that they're not just desolate places where people and culture don't exist. They are still in their own ways thriving, but it's the fact that that's been hindered because of white supremacism and colonization.
Exactly.
Yes.
I mean, that's precisely what Kristina talked about in the episode, wasn't it? It's like all of these, like there were people that were thriving on the island of Madagascar for a very long time, actually even managing microclimates, you know, learning different ways of managing their small agrarian societies. But after colonization, that became literally impossible. So yeah, that is huge. And I guess, okay, one last question. This is what I do. You see, I get into it and I'm like, I could sit here for the next 5 hours and talk about this, no problem. So there's always one last question. But you know, what are the goals for Generation Green in terms of what's coming up with the election, which obviously we know is going to be, you know, kind of a big deal. How do we get these issues on the agenda?
Well, if we're talking about America specifically, which I'm assuming we're talking about America here, I really hate to say it, but there are much bigger issues than our natural environment in the immediate election of America. It's all interconnected, but right now in America, we're seeing Black men and women being gunned down in the streets by police violence. This has been taking place for honestly decades. Nothing has changed. Chattel slavery might have ended, but it exists in new forms in many ways. And they've been inflicting genocide upon Black people for decades. Some would argue millennia. So when it comes to the election and what Generation Green is doing, we are weaving together Black social justice issues through that environmental and climate liberation lens, showing that everything that happens to us as Black people happens in our environment. That could be the natural, that could be the social, political, you know, biological, et cetera, but that all happens in our environment. And in order for us to truly seek and achieve justice and ultimately liberation for these things, we have to connect them, we have to unify, and we have to get on one accord.
Because environmental injustices and climate, it's like a slow killer. It's violence. It's a slow violence. It's a quiet, sometimes violence. But more attention needs to be brought to that and the ways that it's killing us in really huge numbers, right? Or it will. And then, so with our policy platform, we're hoping to tie together all types of different social justice issues and environmental policy, climate policy, and just analyze it through a lens of, like Destiny mentioned, not only equity, but liberation. And first, education is very important to us. So we know that in trying to expand social justice, or not expand, or trying to center environmental injustices in the broader social justice landscape, you do have to make sure folks understand how they connect. Yeah. Education is something we've been talking about, right? So, so that's why in our policy platform, we're hoping to be very informative and not just skip straight ahead to the solutions, but to explain the problems in depth and how the environment is implicated and Black liberation is implicated in each of them. So we have several different categories: climate and clean energy, economic and labor justice, healing justice, land, clean air and clean water. Destiny can add if there are missing any categories, but we're hoping for this to be sort of a framework for what policy-wise something like environmental liberation could look like. And I know with the current state of political affairs in the US, that seems like very ambitious. But the whole point is who cares? You got to be ambitious, because if the conversations aren't happening, if no one's talking about it, if we're not bringing the subject of climate reparation to these political debates, to these forums, the climate talks internationally and nationally, how are we ever going to even start to act around them? So we've got to have these conversations. We've got to introduce this into the mainstream political forum. So that is really our goal right now. And we'll see what the results of the election are like, but maybe we can get more traction with even the environmental justice bills that are currently in Congress once our administration turns over. So that it will be a starting point for us. And we can continue to do our work from there. But
that's incredible. It's amazing. It's yeah, I mean, Mary talks about it a lot too. It's hope is her favorite word. It's her favorite word. But I also really like imagination, and just to reflect back what you just said, like we have to be creative and think big, you know, to be able to get a lot of these things done. And the work that you guys are doing is really nailing that. I'm super impressed with all the work that you're doing. Looking forward to voting for both of you at some point down the line when you both run for office. Destiny's face. And she's on mute.
One of us. I thought you meant voting in November. I'm like, yeah, let's get out
that
the
too.
vote.
Please vote in November. I don't know about us on the ballot, but
one day. Listen, we're sitting here thinking big and using our imaginations right now. So I'm just laying that little juicy piece of goodness out there to just float around the universe for a while. And hopefully it will come back to me, because you guys are amazing. So please, I would love it if you guys stayed in touch with us and kept us posted on what you're doing. We're really big into supporting other women, certainly other Black women in this movement. So let us know how we can help you with that. I would love to connect you with Kristina if you would love to like to do that too, and Liddy. But it's really exciting and inspiring to talk to you both. So thank you for joining us and doing our first ever episode recap on reparations.
Thank you. I appreciate the recap, because it's a conversation you have to really, really get into. And as for supporting us, you can support us by going to our website at gen-green.org/donate. You can make donations. We appreciate all support. And there's more information on there about our mission, about how you can be an ally to Generation Green and things like that.
Yeah, so if you all want to hear more from Generation Green, more about our environmental liberation lens and some of the projects we're working on, please check out the Generation Green podcast. Our season is entitled Black and Breathless, where we talk about how Black people are breathless in more ways than one.
Wow, yeah.
We started around the uprisings earlier this summer, but the conversations have expanded to so many other things that leave us breathless, including our roles at big green organizations and how the culture of race there can be traumatizing. So please head to our podcast. It's available on all platforms, Apple Music, Spotify, and the like. So I think folks from this community will find that pretty valuable and pretty relevant.